Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something pretty significant, a document that just dropped on June 13th, 2025.
That's right. It's a working paper from NITI Aayog, India's main policy think tank.
And it's really trying to chart a course for India's agricultural future, specifically looking at that, well, let's face it, incredibly complex trade relationship with the U.S.
Yeah, this isn't just dry policy stuff. It's a real strategic move trying to deal with some pretty intense global trade heat, particularly from the U.S. side. And it's asking, how can India manage all that, play the global trade game without, pulling the rug out from under its own farmers?
Exactly. That's the core tension, isn't it? You've got agriculture, which is just fundamental to India, nearly half the workforce, a huge part of life.
Huge.
So how do you balance these global trade demands, maybe even bringing in controversial tech like GM crops with protecting your own people, your food supply, your agricultural soul, really?
And the stakes are just massive. Agriculture is vital for GDP, employs so many people. And the U.S. relationship here is key. Though, interestingly, India currently exports more agri-goods to the U.S. than it imports.
Right, about $5.75 billion out versus $2.22 billion in, based on recent figures. So, on paper, a surplus.
But that's where the pressure cooker element comes in, especially with the return of the previous U.S. administration in January 2025.
Ah, yes, the focus on reciprocal tariffs.
Exactly. It's very transactional. You tax us, we tax you, maybe more. We've seen it already, right? That 26% tariff on some Indian goods.
So India absolutely needs a smart response, a strategy.
And this NITI Aayog paper is their attempt at outlining one. It's kind of like a high wire act they're proposing.
Yeah, High Wire Act, I like that. Balancing global ambition with protecting what's vital at home.
Precisely. And navigating some very tricky political waters, too.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. Let's unpack what NITI Aayog is actually suggesting here. What are the specifics? What's the thinking? And crucially, why is it already stirring up so much debate?
All right, let's get into it. The central plank of their strategy seems to be what they're calling this dual-track approach.
Dual track. Okay. Sounds like trying to do two things at once. How does that work?
Well, that's pretty much it. It means dealing with the short term and the long term simultaneously.
Right.
So track one, short-term moves. This involves making some, let's say, calculated concessions on imports from the U.S., things that are maybe less sensitive for India.
The goal being to, take the heat off?
Yeah.
Ease those trade tensions you mentioned? Avoid more tariffs?
Exactly that. A bit of tactical give to prevent bigger problems down the line. That's the immediate focus.
Okay, makes sense. And the second track?
That's the long game. This is all about fundamentally boosting Indian agriculture, making it stronger, more productive, efficient, ready to compete globally.
So less reactive, more proactive?
Yeah.
Building for the future.
That's the idea. Building a sector that can stand on its own feet in the global market regardless of immediate pressures.
Okay, this dual approach, short-term fixes, long-term strength. It sounds quite pragmatic on the surface, but where does the controversy really ignite?
Well, it flares up pretty intensely within that short-term track. Some of the most, let's say, dramatic proposals are there.
Like what?
This is where the paper suggests, cautiously, opening the door to importing genetically modified crops. Specifically, they name soybeans and corn.
GM crops. Right, that's always a major flashpoint in India, isn't it? What's the rationale NITI Aayog puts forward for even going there?
They lay out an argument based heavily on numbers, on bridging what they call a significant yield gap.
Yield gap, meaning India produces much less per hectare than the U.S. for these crops.
Significantly less. Take soybeans. India gets around 1 ton per hectare. The U.S., 3.4 tons.
Wow.
And maize or corn, it's even starker. India is at about 3.5 tons per hectare, while the U.S. average is a huge 11.1 tons.
Okay, that is a massive difference. So the logic is we need more of these crops domestically, and importing GM versions is a potential way to fill that gap, maybe quickly.
That's the core pitch. And they even suggest specific uses. For GM maize, they talk about using it for ethanol blending.
Right. Helps with renewable fuel goals.
And, crucially, for animal feed. There's a big domestic need there. They even float the idea that leftover feed could potentially be exported down the line.
Interesting. And what about the GM soybeans? What's the angle there?
That ties directly into India's huge edible oil import bill. India's the world's biggest importer, spending something like $10 billion a year. It's massive.
$10 billion. Just on edible oils.
Yeah. So the thinking in the paper is that importing GM soybeans, which might have higher yields or oil content, could help chip away at that enormous import dependence.
Okay, I can see the economic argument they're making,
Mhm.
addressing domestic shortfalls and import bills. But like you said, hugely controversial. What are the main pushbacks, the risks people are pointing to?
Oh, the pushback is strong. You hear critics like Dr. Rajaram Tripathi from farmer organizations voicing serious fears. They worry India could become a dumping ground for surplus GM produce from abroad.
Undercutting local farmers.
That's the primary economic fear. It could potentially devastate prices for Indian farmers growing conventional varieties. But it goes deeper.
Deeper how?
Concerns about food sovereignty, India losing control over its own food supply by becoming reliant on foreign GM seeds and imports. Then there are worries about biodiversity.
Cross-pollination, displacing local varieties.
Exactly. And potential health concerns, though the science there is often debated. It's a whole bundle of anxieties.
And the shadow of past experiences looms large too, right? Like with Brit cotton.
Absolutely. People haven't forgotten Monsanto and the whole Brit cotton story. It was introduced back in 2002, now covers over 95% of cotton fields.
It did boost yields initially, didn't it?
It did, but there have been issues since. Pests developing resistance, the high cost of seeds, farmer debt linked to it. So there's this real fear that allowing GM food crop imports opens the door to similar dependency on large multinational agribusiness corporations.
And we should remember, GM food crops are basically banned for cultivation in India right now, apart from cotton. The whole issue is under strict Supreme Court review.
That's right. We just saw that split verdict on GM mustard. Proponents say it could boost yields by maybe 30%, but it's still stuck, not approved for release.
And even the government sounds cautious. Didn't the Agriculture Minister, Shivraj Singh Chauhan, say something recently about not wanting to play with nature?
He did around June 8th. He spoke about weighing gains and losses carefully. It just shows how politically sensitive this is. It touches deep-seated cultural and ecological nerves.
So given all this controversy, what kind of safeguard does the NITI Aayog paper actually propose if GM imports were allowed?
Their main suggestion is stringent labeling laws. Make it absolutely clear on the packaging if a product contains GM ingredients so consumers can choose.
Labeling. Is that seen as enough, though, by the critics?
Widely questioned. Critics argue labeling alone doesn't address the potential environmental impacts, the economic threat to farmers, or the broader food sovereignty questions.
Okay, so GM imports are the really explosive part of the short-term plan. What other, maybe less controversial concessions does the paper talk about to ease trade friction?
It also suggests lowering tariffs on certain U.S. imports that are deemed non-sensitive. The logic is to pick items where reducing the import duty won't really hurt Indian farmers or producers much.
Can you give an example? What counts as non-sensitive?
Well, they mention things like pistachios, almonds, and quite specifically, off-season apples.
Off-season apples, why that distinction?
It's key. U.S. apples currently face a hefty 50% import duty. The paper argues that lowering this duty wouldn't significantly impact, say, apple growers in Himachal Pradesh because the main U.S. apple export season doesn't clash directly with India's peak harvest time.
So it's about finding those specific windows or products where there isn't direct, intense competition. Granting market access where India isn't producing much at that moment anyway.
Precisely. It's trying to be surgical about it. Give the U.S. something, but minimize the domestic pain.
Smart. But even while suggesting these openings, the paper emphasizes protecting other areas very strongly, right?
Absolutely. It specifically flags poultry and dairy as sectors needing strong non-tariff safeguards. Not just tariffs, but other measures.
Why poultry and dairy? What makes them so different?
Well, with poultry, Indian farmers are already pretty worried about the prospect of cheap U.S. chicken flooding the market. It's a big concern for their livelihoods.
Right, depressing prices.
And dairy. Well, dairy in India is almost sacred. It's deeply tied to culture, the rural economy, millions of smallholder farmers. Any policy seen as threatening the dairy sector, especially from foreign competition, would be incredibly politically charged. Massive resistance guaranteed.
So for those, the paper suggests maybe using things other than tariffs, like stricter quality rules or quotas.
Exactly. Things like sanitary and phytosanitary standards, maybe import quotas, ways to manage the flow and protect the domestic industry without just relying on import duties.
Okay, so that's the short-term balancing act. Calculated concessions, possibly including GM, surgical tariff cuts, but iron walls around sensitive sectors like dairy and poultry. Now, what about track 2, that long-term vision? making Indian agriculture a global heavyweight.
Right. This is the more aspirational part. It's about building the foundations for the future, tying into that larger national goal of Viksit Bharat's developed India by 2047. It really focuses on systemic reforms and big investments.
And technology is a big piece of this, I imagine.
Huge piece. They talk a lot about leveraging digital tools for farmers. Things like promoting apps, Umang, Kisan, that give farmers direct access to information on subsidies, market prices, weather, all on their phones.
Empowering them with data.
Yes. And also pushing for precision agriculture, using drones for better crop monitoring and targeted spraying, optimizing water use, cutting down on waste. Even things like blockchain for supply chain transparency.
Blockchain, how would that work?
To track produce from farm to consumer, ensure fair payments, build trust, it's about modernizing the whole system. And there are active campaigns, like that Viksit Krishi Sankalp Abhiyan started in late May 2025, trying to get millions of farmers familiar with these modern techniques.
So tech adoption is key. What else is critical for this long-term transformation?
Infrastructure. Massive need there. India loses so much food post-harvest because of poor storage and transport. The paper really stresses building better cold storage chains, efficient logistics to link farms to markets, cut down that spoilage.
Reducing waste, improving farmer income, makes sense, and competitive value chains. Is that about cutting out middlemen?
That's a big part of it. Streamlining the journey from field to plate, making sure the farmer who bears the risk actually gets a fairer slice of the final price. The paper also hints that some state-level agricultural rules need updating to help make this happen.
And you can't talk about the future of Indian agriculture without talking about climate change, surely.
Absolutely not. It's a massive shadow hanging over everything. Erratic weather is the new normal. 2024 was India's warmest year recorded since 1901, remember?
I do. And the monsoon is becoming so unpredictable.
Exactly. Models suggest even a 1 degree Celsius rise could seriously dent wheat yields. So the paper strongly pushes for investment in climate-resilient crops, better water management, and, crucially, fixing the creaky old agricultural extension network, the system that's supposed to get new research and techniques out to the farmers. It needs a serious overhaul.
Okay, so it's a really comprehensive modernization plan.
Yeah.
Tech, logistics, fair pricing, climate resilience. How does this long-term vision connect back to the immediate trade negotiations with the U.S. that the paper seems geared towards?
It frames the negotiation as a potential give and take. India might consider lowering barriers on some U.S. imports, maybe even soybean oil, as we discussed, to meet domestic needs.
If. There's always an if.
If the U.S., in return, provides better, more predictable market access for India's key agricultural exports, things where India's competitive shrimp, basmati rice, certain spices.
So it's setting up potential bargaining chips. We'll consider this concession on X if you give us better terms for Y.
That seems to be the underlying strategy. The paper even mentions using tools like tariff rate quotas or TRQs.
TRQs. How do they work?
They allow a certain amount of a specific product in at a low duty, but imports above that quota face a much higher tariff. It's a way to offer some access, manage the volume, and limit disruption to domestic markets.
A controlled opening, essentially. But still, going back to the politics, any move impacting farmers is sensitive ground in India. How does the paper account for that reality?
It has to acknowledge it. The memory of farmer protests is very fresh. Minister Chauhan's recent cautious comments reinforce this. Any deal that looks like it's harming farmers, especially smallholders, will inevitably face strong political headwinds.
So pulling it all together, NITI Aayog is really outlining an incredibly delicate balancing act here. It's trying to find a way to meet U.S. trade demands, potentially using controversial levers like GM imports and tariff adjustments,
while simultaneously shielding core domestic sectors like dairy and poultry and launching this ambitious long-term project to transform Indian agriculture from the ground up.
It's a seriously high-stakes game. This paper, it feels less like a final decree and more like a strategic blueprint, a possible script for navigating these treacherous waters.
I think that's a good way to put it. The actual final cut, the real outcome, hinges entirely on those upcoming trade negotiations, likely kicking off later in 2025, maybe in the fall. It will require immense diplomatic finesse to juggle the international pressures with the domestic compulsions.
And you're right, this is so much more than just trade figures. It touches on technology, sovereignty, the future of millions of livelihoods, and really the direction of India's entire development journey.
The ultimate goal outlined seems to be finding that sweet spot, a balance that allows India to engage globally, modernize its agriculture, but without sacrificing its core interests or its farmers.
Which leaves us, and you, with a pretty profound question to chew on. As India considers embracing technologies like GM crops for potential gains in trade and productivity, how does it weigh those benefits against the very real risks to its incredible biodiversity, its unique farming culture, and the livelihoods of its vast farming population?
Yeah, what responsibility does a nation ultimately have to safeguard its agricultural heritage and ecosystems when faced with the powerful currents of global trade? That's the tightrope India is walking right now, and the answer will shape its future for years to come.